So I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are standing in a remote, incredibly quiet Idaho forest.
Right, way out in the backcountry.
Yeah, exactly. And you're doing a completely mundane, like repetitive scientific job, picking measurements, writing down numbers. It's literally just you, your coworker, and the trees.
Sounds pretty peaceful, honestly.
It does, right. And you actually earplugs in because you're running a chainsaw. But then suddenly you turn around and there are three people walking right up to you, pointing hunting rifles directly at your stomach.
I mean, it's just a terrifying image. The
Yeah,
sheer shock of that moment.
it's wild.
Yeah, the sudden collision of this ordinary administrative work and, well, the threat of lethal violence. That's really what makes the historical record of August 27, 1976 so compelling.
It really is.
Because, we are looking at an event where the human stakes are incredibly high, but the entire confrontation eventually gets swallowed by a complete legal void.
Which is exactly what our mission is for today's deep dive. We've got this fascinating stack of sources to pull from to understand the single day and its massive legal aftermath.
And we're talking primary sources here.
Right. We're looking at the workers' own contemporaneous written statements, local newspaper clippings that covered the trial, and, of course, the federal court records. And the goal here isn't to take a side. We're looking objectively at how this very real confrontation basically evaporated on a legal technicality.
Yeah, the story unfolds between two U.S. Forest Service workers and a family of independent gold miners. And they just completely collide in the Nez Perce National Forest.
So let's set the scene. Who are the workers?
Well, the primary source for the workers' side is this meticulously detailed statement. It was written just days after the event by Nicole McKenzie, who went by Nick.
Okay.
Nick was a computer programmer and a research worker for the Forest Service. And he's out there with a college student named Gary O'Malley. They were working on a test plot, specifically plot number 2.
Right, and the coordinates for that are like T28N-R9E S7NWNW, which
Yeah.
a total mouthful.
Right. It sounds like a random string of data. But, to Nick and Gary, this was literally their office for the day.
Exactly. And what they were doing was researching the tussock moth, which is this highly destructive insect that defoliates Douglas fir trees. So they're taking sample discs from this massive 38.5-inch Douglas fir.
Right. So Nick is making a side cut on this partially rotten tree. He's totally focused, right? He shuts off the saw to wait for Gary to come help him watch the tree crown, so it doesn't fall the wrong way.
Standard forestry procedure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So he shouts for Gary and nothing. No
Yeah.
response.
Right, and eventually Gary comes scrambling down the slope, and Nick actually notes in his written statement that Gary looks obviously disturbed, like really rattled.
I would be too.
Oh, for sure. So Gary physically reaches out, removes Nick's earplugs, and he just whispers that there's an old man and two women up the hill. And, they're armed with rifles, and they are demanding the two researchers get off the land. I mean, that stomach drop has to be unbearable. You are miles from nowhere.
Yeah, the isolation really amplifies the threat.
So Nick and Gary pack up their gear immediately, and Nick's statement says they hiked, quote, 4 chains up the hill to their vehicle. And I gotta ask, what exactly does a chain mean in this context? Is that like a forestry term?
It is, yeah. A chain is a traditional unit of measurement in forestry and surveying. It's equal to exactly 66 feet.
Okay, got it.
So when he says 4 chains, it means they hiked about 260 feet up the slope. And waiting for them at the top, basically blocking the dirt road near their vehicle, is this family.
The patrons.
Right. You have 64-year-old Floyd Patrin Sr., his wife Elsie, and their 30-year-old daughter-in-law Barbara. And alongside them is an unarmed 12-year-old boy.
And the level of visual detail that Nick captures in his statement is wild, especially considering the extreme duress he was under. Like, he locks in on exactly what Barbara Patrin is wearing.
Yeah, his memory is incredibly sharp there.
He describes this unique khaki nylon military jacket. He notes specific black-on-green military insignia. He even remembers this triangle shape on her left breast pocket, although he said he couldn't quite make out the unit crest.
And, that kind of hyper-focus is actually a documented psychological response. When adrenaline spikes during a life-threatening event, your brain starts taking these high-definition snapshots.
Oh, absolutely.
Because as he is taking in the details of this jacket, Nick is staring right down the barrel of a .30 caliber scopeless hunting rifle. aimed right at his gut from about 5 feet away.
His written description of that is just chilling. He wrote, the large black bore of the barrel is quite a vivid memory. It gave me a rather uncomfortable feeling then and now.
Understatement of the year. Like,
Seriously. And meanwhile, the patrons are just laying into them. Nick recalls them talking at him, not really to him. They're just venting all this frustration about federal timber policy.
right, they see him as a symbol, not a person.
Exactly. The woman in the army jacket tells him that first somebody like him comes out there, and pretty soon there's a clear cut. Like, they make it very clear they despise clear cutting.
And the dialogue Nick records is fascinating here, because the patrons emphasize that they are on public domain land, but in the very same breath, they claim it is their patented mining claim.
Right.
And this right here is the crux of the entire confrontation. Floyd Patrin bought the nearby Gold Point mill back in the 1950s, and he felt absolute ownership over that entire area.
Wait, let's unpack that legal terminology really quick because it seems completely central to why the patrons felt justified holding scientists at gunpoint.
Yeah, it's really the core issue.
You mentioned a patented mining claim. Do they actually own the land, or is it public forest?
Well, that is exactly where centuries of law collide. So, under the General Mining Act of 1872, a citizen can explore public lands and stake an unpatented mining claim.
Okay, unpatented.
Right. That gives you the exclusive right to extract minerals. But the federal government, in this case the Forest Service, still owns the surface land, and they manage the timber.
Ah, I see.
Now, a patented claim is totally different. That means the federal government has actually passed the title of the land directly to the claimant, making it completely private property.
So if they only had an unpatented claim, they essentially owned the rocks underneath, but the Forest Service still fully owned the trees that Nick and Gary were studying.
Exactly the issue.
Yeah.
But the patrons treated the area as their sovereign territory anyway.
Right, regardless of the exact paperwork.
Yeah, to them, the Forest Service wasn't just an employer of scientists. It was this distant, oppressive landlord that was constantly interfering with their livelihood.
I mean, I think a good analogy for you as a listener to ground this is it's like being an IT technician sent to fix a router in an office building, and suddenly you are taken hostage over a decades-old ideological conflict that you have absolutely nothing to do with.
That's a really great way to put it. The researchers were literally just collecting tree data. But to the patrons, those two men represented the entire weight of the federal government coming to take away their autonomy.
But obviously, holding people at gunpoint is going to escalate things. And when this inevitably lands in a Moscow, Idaho courtroom, the reality of that day completely splits into competing narratives.
It really does. Because in any court of law, reality gets filtered through testimony. And the trial clippings we have from the Lewiston Morning Tribune in March 1977 show us exactly how the defense framed this event.
Right, because Floyd, Elsie, and Barbara Patrin all took the witness stand.
They did. And their story doesn't start with a tussock moth study at all. For them, it starts with a noise across the canyon.
Right.
They were at their cabin, they heard a chainsaw and a bulldozer, and they went to investigate what they firmly believed were trespassers encroaching on their mining claim.
And this is where it gets kind of crazy. When the prosecutor presses Floyd Patrin on why his family needed to bring hunting rifles just to investigate a noise, his answer is honestly baffling.
Yeah, he testifies that he never actually pointed the guns at the men.
Right, and as for carrying them, he literally tells the court, you never know when you're going to encounter an irritated bull moose or a cougar.
The bull moose defense, I mean, out of context, it sounds almost comical.
It really does.
But their defense attorney, David Swain, he leaned heavily into this cultural chasm between the defendants and the researchers. He basically built a narrative that Nick and Gary, being city dwellers, just fundamentally misunderstood backcountry norms.
Wait, you're telling me the defense attorney looked a jury in the eye and essentially argued that bringing 3 rifles to a timber dispute was just like standard forest etiquette? Did the jury actually buy that?
Well, Swain's argument to the jury was very direct. He said of backcountry miners, quote, they habitually carry firearms. They have the right to keep and bear arms. They just do it. You don't have to explain it. He was trying to establish that the intent wasn't to threaten federal workers, but merely self-protection in the wild. Or at worst, just a standard display of authority on a mining claim.
I have to push back on that conceptually, though, because, sure, carrying a gun in the remote Idaho woods for cougars makes sense in a vacuum. But there is a chilling, specific detail from the trial that totally shatters the whole we were just looking for a moose defense.
You're talking about the comment made to the child.
Yes, exactly. Gary O'Malley testified under oath that the 12-year-old relative who was standing with the patrons looked at Barbara and actually asked her what the guns were for.
Yeah, and her response is so telling.
Right. Barbara reportedly replied, quote, "It adds a very nice effect." I mean, how does a court of law weigh an atmospheric nice effect against the visceral, physical terror of a large black bore aimed at a man's stomach?
That question really cuts to the core of criminal law. It's the constant friction between intent and perception. The defense tries to isolate the patron's subjective intent, which they claim was just harmless preparedness. But the prosecution focuses heavily on the victim's perception, which was an imminent threat to their lives.
And the judge has to sort through all of this.
Exactly. The judge has to filter these competing subjective realities through very rigid rules of evidence. And the presiding judge in this case, Judge Ray McNichols, he makes a ruling that completely alters the trajectory of the trial.
Yeah, this is the part of the trial I can only really describe as Schrodinger's bullets.
That's a perfect name for it.
Because the patrons were originally charged with assault on a federal officer with a deadly weapon, which, is a severe charge carrying up to 10 years in federal prison. But Judge McNichols strikes the deadly weapon charge entirely. He reduces it down to simple assault.
And the reason he reduced it is because the prosecution could not definitively prove the guns were loaded at the exact moment of the confrontation.
Which is mind-boggling.
Yeah, Floyd Patrin testified that there were no shells in the firing chambers of any of the guns, even though he openly admitted there was ammunition in the magazines.
I just have to express utter disbelief on behalf of anyone listening to this right now, because clearly Nick and Gary didn't stop to politely ask the patrons to inspect the chambers of the rifles currently pointed at their stomachs.
Right, they're a little busy fearing for their lives.
Exactly. So because they couldn't check, the government couldn't prove the weapons were legally deadly at that exact second.
That's the law. The burden of proof is entirely on the government. If the statute specifically says a deadly weapon, the government must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the object was capable of dealing death in that moment.
Wow.
An unloaded gun, legally speaking, under the precedents the judge was applying at the time, just didn't meet the threshold for that specific enhanced charge.
It's like being forced into a high-stakes game of poker, but the rules suddenly dictate that you have to prove exactly what cards your opponent is holding before you are legally allowed to call their bluff. I mean, if you are looking at a .30 caliber rifle 5 feet from your gut, your reality is that it is loaded.
Absolutely. But the law operates on its own internal logic, and that logic often defies the common sense of lived experience. So, as a result of that reduced charge, the jury convicted Floyd and Barbara Patrin only of simple assault.
And what about Elsie?
They acquitted Elsie Patrin entirely. So Floyd received a 2-year suspended sentence and probation.
Which means he essentially dodged a massive federal prison sentence.
He did.
But Floyd remained entirely unrepentant about the whole thing. He actually told the local press, quote, "I still feel I'm falsely accused." Like, he truly believed he was just defending his rightful claim from an intruding government.
And, the probation wasn't the end of it either. The patrons actually appealed their simple assault convictions.
Right, they kept fighting.
Yeah, and this appeal is where the human stakes, the terror Nick felt in the woods, the ideological standoff over the mining claim, the whole debate over loaded chambers, all of it completely dissolves into strict, bloodless bureaucracy.
Because the story shifts to April 20, 1978, with the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And the convictions evaporate entirely based on how you define a federal worker.
Yes.
I mean, how does an appeal over an assault in the woods turn into a debate over grammar?
We have to look at the machinery of the law at that time. The patrons were charged under 2 specific federal statutes, 18 U.S.C., Section 111, and Section 1114.
Okay, stay with us here.
Right, so Section 111 makes it a federal crime to assault a government officer, but it doesn't apply to just anyone. Section 1114 is the statute that actually provides the definition of who counts as an officer.
And back then, it wasn't just a broad definition.
Yeah, exactly. In the 1970s, Section 1114 wasn't some blanket protection for all federal employees. It was a highly specific laundry list of jobs.
Why would Congress write a law like that? I mean, why not just say, don't assault anyone who works for the federal government?
It really just goes back to how Congress historically drafted legislation. They built these laws piecemeal. Whenever a specific type of federal worker faced a new, public threat, Congress would amend the statute to add them to the list.
That sounds like a nightmare to keep updated.
It was. So Section 1114 read like this bizarre catalog of professions. It listed customs officers, mail carriers, park rangers, meat inspectors, just very specific roles.
So the government prosecutors had to prove that Nick and Gary, as tree researchers, somehow fit into one of the highly specific categories on that list.
Precisely the bind they were in. And during the trial, prosecutors realized Forest Service scientists weren't explicitly listed anywhere in the statute.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. There was a category for employees protecting game and other wild birds and animals. But the prosecutor had to admit in open court that Nick and Gary weren't dealing with birds or animals. They were measuring trees.
Right.
So the government explicitly conceded they could not use that category.
Instead, they put all their chips on a totally different clause. Let's call it the animal disease category.
Right, yeah. There was a clause protecting any Department of Agriculture employee designated to, and I'm quoting here, carry out any law or regulation, or to perform any function in connection with any federal or state program for the control of animal diseases.
Okay.
So the government prosecutors argue that the phrase, carry out any law or regulation, stood completely on its own as a broad, independent protection.
They were essentially saying, hey, Nick and Gary were carrying out a regulation by doing tussock moth research, so they are protected.
That was the argument, yeah?
But the appellate court did this brutal grammatical dissection of that statute. The Ninth Circuit ruled that the phrase, carry out any law or regulation, was inextricably tied to the end of the sentence.
Yep, it all came down to modifiers.
It was modified by the phrase, for the control or eradication or prevention of the introduction or dissemination of animal diseases.
The court basically looked at the strict structure of the English language. They said you can't just sever a phrase from its grammatical moorings to make a conviction stick. The entire clause was about animal diseases. And, the tussock moth is an insect, sure, but it's damage strictly to the Douglas fir. It is a tree issue, not an animal disease.
Right.
Because Nick and Gary were not controlling an animal disease, the court ruled they were not protected under the statutory definition of a federal officer.
This is where you really realize the legal system is essentially just a computer running code.
That's a great way to think about it.
The court requires specific inputs, right? Input A, assault on a federal officer. Input B, officer must meet the exact definition in Section 1114. So when the prosecution types in tussock moth researcher, the code doesn't match the required input of animal disease controller.
Exactly.
The computer doesn't care that 3 people pointed hunting rifles at a man's stomach. It just throws an error code and shuts down the program.
That is an incredibly accurate analogy. When that error code hit, the court ruled it lacked subject matter jurisdiction, which is a legal term meaning the court literally does not have the authority to hear the case anymore.
It's just over.
Yeah, because the government conceded they couldn't use the game protection category. And the court ruled the animal disease category didn't apply grammatically. The entire foundation of the federal charge just collapsed. The convictions of Floyd and Barbara Patrin were reversed, completely tossed out.
I want you, the listener, to just think about the magnitude of that outcome. The appellate court didn't look at the evidence and say the assault didn't happen.
No, they didn't dispute the facts at all.
Right. They didn't rule that the patrons were innocent of pointing those guns. The court simply ruled that because of the placement of a modifier in a sentence passed by a distant Congress, the victims didn't fit the statutory parameters required to be considered victims in a federal court.
It perfectly illustrates the sometimes vast, unbridgeable chasm between lived reality and the legal system. The law is just a machine made of words, and sometimes flesh and blood reality simply slips right through the gears.
So, synthesizing this strange arc from August 1976 to the appellate reversal in 1978, it just leaves us with this massive disconnect.
A huge one.
The confrontation in the Nez Perce National Forest was undeniably real. The trauma for Nick and Gary, the very real fear of losing their lives over a sample of partially rotten wood, was an absolute fact.
And on the other side of it, the patrons' unyielding defiance of federal authority, their desperate need to protect what they felt was their sovereign livelihood, that was a deeply ingrained reality of their lives, too.
Yet the justice system could only process this explosive, deeply human event through the lens of missing bullets and misplaced modifiers.
Yeah, the courts didn't actually resolve the underlying tension between the independent miners and the federal government. They just dismissed the entire conflict on a technicality.
Which leaves you with a final thought to ponder long after this deep dive ends. What happens to a society when the legal system is so structurally detached from lived reality?
It's a huge question.
Because both the victims of this assault and the perpetrators claiming self-defense were left feeling that the true conflict was never actually addressed, let alone resolved. Does this kind of bureaucratic detachment, where your trauma or your livelihood is reduced to a debate over sentence diagramming, actually fuel the very anti-government grievance that sparked the confrontation in the first place?
I mean, when the system fails to address the human element of a conflict, the anger doesn't just disappear, it just metastasizes and finds another outlet.
Imagine again standing in that quiet Idaho forest, the smell of fresh-cut pine in the air. The guns are finally lowered, the trucks drive away. But the silence that follows isn't peace. It's just a void waiting to be filled again.